At the heart of a bustling industrial city stood Grayson Industries, a company known for its cutting-edge technology and innovative solutions. It was a place where dreams were built, machines hummed with life, and people worked tirelessly to push boundaries. Leading this empire was Mr. Richard Grayson, a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and factories alike. Richard was not just any CEO. He was confident, intelligent, and often described as someone who thrived on challenges. He believed that success came from testing limits, both his own and those of others. On a crisp Monday morning, Richard decided to walk through the factory floor instead of staying cooped up in his office. He liked these walks. They gave him a chance to observe the operations firsthand and connect with employees. As he strolled past rows of gleaming machinery, nodding at workers who greeted him respectfully, his attention was drawn to a quiet corner of the factory. There, an older man was bent over, wiping down a dusty workbench. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused, but there was something steady about the way he moved, a calmness that seemed out of place amidst the chaos of the factory. This man was Joe, the janitor. Everyone knew Joe. He had been with the company for years, quietly sweeping floors, fixing minor issues, and keeping things running smoothly behind the scenes. No one paid him much attention beyond polite nods or occasional requests for help. But today, Richard found himself pausing near Joe's workstation. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was boredom, but whatever the reason, Richard couldn't resist striking up a conversation. "Morning, Joe," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. Joe looked up, surprised to see the CEO standing so close. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," he replied politely, straightening up slightly. Richard glanced around the area, his eyes landing on a massive engine nearby, the centerpiece of the factory's latest project. This engine was unlike anything the company had ever built before. It was sleek, powerful, and packed with advanced technology. However, for weeks now, it had been giving the engineering team headaches. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't figure out why it kept malfunctioning. The delays were costing the company time and money, and frustration was mounting among the staff. As Richard stared at the engine, an idea began to form in his mind, an idea fueled by arrogance and a desire to prove a point. Turning back to Joe, he said with a smirk, "You know, Joe, I've always wondered, do you think you could fix something like that?" He gestured toward the engine, his tone laced with mockery. The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Joe blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Fix the engine? Him? A janitor? The thought seemed absurd, even laughable. Around them, other workers stopped what they were doing, craning their necks to see how Joe would respond. Some snickered under their breath, while others exchanged curious glances. After all, everyone knew Joe wasn't an engineer. He didn't have degrees, hanging on the wall or fancy titles next to his name. Yet here was the CEO, challenging him to take on a task that had stumped the brightest minds in the company. For a moment, Joe considered brushing off the comment with a chuckle or a polite refusal. But then, something shifted in his expression. Maybe it was the challenge itself, or perhaps it was the flicker of doubt in Richard's eyes, a subtle hint that the CEO didn't truly believe he could succeed. Whatever the reason, Joe felt a spark of determination ignite within him. "I don't know if I can fix it, Mr. Grayson," Joe said slowly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But I'm willing to give it a try." His words caught everyone off guard, including Richard. The CEO raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by Joe's sudden confidence. For a brief second, Richard wondered if he'd underestimated the man, but just as quickly he dismissed the thought. How could a janitor possibly understand the complexities of such a machine? Still, Richard couldn't resist pushing further. "All right, Joe," Richard said, crossing his arms and leaning back slightly. "Let's see what you're made of. If you manage to fix that engine, I'll personally acknowledge your achievement in front of the entire company." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But if you fail?" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Joe nodded, unfazed by the stakes. "Fair enough," he replied simply. As Richard walked away, the factory buzzed with chatter. Workers whispered excitedly, speculating about whether Joe would actually attempt the impossible. Some thought it was a joke, a publicity stunt orchestrated by the CEO. Others saw it as a cruel test designed to embarrass the janitor. Only a few dared to entertain the possibility that Joe might actually succeed. Meanwhile, Joe returned to his workbench, lost in thought. He knew the challenge ahead of him was daunting, but deep down he felt a strange sense of familiarity. The engine may have been new, but its components, the gears, pistons, and circuits, were old friends to him. They reminded him of a time long past, a time when he wasn't just a janitor sweeping floors, but that was a story for another day. For now, Joe rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a toolbox, and headed toward the engine. Little did anyone know, the humble janitor was about to set off a chain of events that would leave the entire company stunned and reveal secrets buried far deeper than anyone could imagine. The factory floor buzzed with anticipation the next morning. Word of Richard's challenge had spread like wildfire, and everyone wanted to know what Joe would do. Would he actually try to fix the engine, or would he back out quietly? Some employees placed bets while others gathered in small groups, whispering theories about why the CEO had singled out the janitor. Despite the chatter, no one truly believed Joe could succeed. After all, how could a man who spent his days cleaning floors and fixing leaky faucets possibly understand the inner workings of such a complex machine? Joe, however, seemed unfazed by the attention. He arrived at work as usual, carrying his old toolbox and wearing his worn-out coveralls. If he felt any pressure, he didn't show it. Instead, he walked straight to the engine, circling it slowly as if studying every inch of its shiny exterior. The massive machine loomed over him, a labyrinth of pipes, wires, and gears that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. To most people it looked intimidating, a puzzle designed for experts. But to Joe, it was something else entirely. As he stood, there lost in thought, a young engineer named Sarah approached him cautiously. She had been part of the team struggling to repair the engine and couldn't help but feel curious about the janitor's sudden involvement. "Excuse me, Joe," she said hesitantly, clutching her clipboard. "Do you, need anything? Tools? Manuals? Anything at all?" Joe turned to her with a faint smile. "Thanks, Sarah, but I'll manage," he replied. His voice was calm, almost reassuring. Without another word, he knelt down and opened his toolbox, pulling out a few basic tools. Then, much to everyone's surprise, he began disassembling parts of the engine. The sight of Joe working on the machine drew a crowd. Workers gathered around, watching in stunned silence as he methodically examined each component. He didn't rush or hesitate. Instead, his movements were deliberate, confident, and precise. It was as though he'd done this 1,000 times before. Every now and then he muttered softly to himself, words like pressure valve and fuel injector, phrases that made no sense to the average person, but caught the ears of the engineers nearby. Richard, too, kept a close eye on the situation, from a distance. At first, he had dismissed Joe's acceptance of the challenge as a fluke, a momentary lapse of judgment. But as the hours passed, he found himself growing increasingly intrigued. There was something about the way Joe handled the engine that didn't match the image of a simple janitor. His hands moved with familiarity, as if they belonged to someone who had spent years tinkering with machines far more advanced than this. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Joe than met the eye. By the end of the day, Joe had made significant progress. Several faulty parts had been replaced and the engine's hum grew steadier, louder. Still, the problem wasn't fully resolved. When asked how long it would take to finish, Joe simply shrugged. "A few more days," he said. "Maybe less, depending on what I find." His nonchalant attitude only added to the mystery surrounding him. People began speculating about his background. Was he secretly an engineer? Had he worked on similar projects somewhere else? Or was he just getting lucky? No one knew for sure, and Joe offered no answers. He remained focused on the task at hand, refusing to engage in gossip or speculation. Despite the mounting curiosity, not everyone was supportive. Some workers resented Joe's sudden rise to prominence, believing it undermined their own efforts. Others doubted his abilities and whispered behind his back, convinced he would fail spectacularly. Even Richard, for all his intrigue, still harbored doubts. He couldn't bring himself to believe that a janitor could achieve what his top engineers hadn't. Surely there had to be some explanation, a stroke of luck, perhaps, or a hidden trick. But as the days went by, Joe's determination never wavered. He worked tirelessly, often staying late into the night when the factory was empty. The quiet solitude suited him, allowing him to focus without distractions. During these hours, memories from his past occasionally surfaced. Memories of engines bigger and more complicated than this one, of long nights spent solving problems that seemed unsolvable. Those memories reminded him of who he once was and why he had chosen to step away from that life. Yet here he was, drawn back into it, almost against his will. One evening, as Joe sat alone beside the engine, Richard appeared unexpectedly. He had been unable to resist checking on the progress and found Joe hunched over a dismantled section of the machine, deep in concentration. For a moment, Richard hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You're still here," he observed, his tone neutral. Joe glanced up, unsurprised by the CEO's presence. "Where else would I be?" he replied lightly. Richard chuckled despite himself. "Most people would have given up by now." "Not my style," Joe said, returning his attention to the engine. "Besides, I promised I'd give it a try." There was a pause during which Richard studied the older man carefully. Something about Joe's demeanor struck him as familiar, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "You seem comfortable with this," Richard remarked finally. "Like you've done it before." Joe froze for a fraction of a second, his hands hovering over the engine. Then, without looking up, he said, "Everyone's got a story, Mr. Grayson. Mine's just a little different." The cryptic response left Richard even more curious. What kind of story could explain Joe's uncanny skill? And why did it feel like he'd heard this story before? These questions lingered in his mind as he bid Joe goodnight and left the factory. Over the next few days, Joe continued his work, steadily uncovering the root cause of the engine's malfunction. Each breakthrough brought him closer to success, and closer to revealing the truth about himself. Meanwhile, the rest of the company watched and waited, their skepticism gradually giving way to awe. They had underestimated the janitor, and now they were beginning to realize just how wrong they had been. Unbeknownst to everyone, including Richard, Joe's journey was about to take an unexpected turn. Beneath the surface of his quiet confidence lay a secret so profound that it would change everything, not just for Joe, but for the entire company. And as the pieces of the puzzle came together, the line between past and present began to blur, setting the stage for revelations that no one saw coming. By the third day of Joe's work on the engine, the atmosphere in the factory had shifted. What had started as a bizarre challenge issued by the CEO had now become a spectacle that captivated everyone. Workers who once doubted Joe's abilities began to watch him with newfound respect. Engineers who had spent weeks trying to solve the problem stood nearby, taking notes and asking questions. Even Richard Grayson made frequent visits to check on the progress, though he remained quiet. Observing more than speaking, Joe, however, seemed oblivious to the growing attention. He worked methodically, his focus unwavering. Each morning he arrived at the same time, armed with his toolbox and a steaming cup of coffee. By the afternoon, sweat dampened his brow, but he showed no signs of fatigue. Instead, there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a look of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As Joe continued disassembling and reassembling parts of the engine, he occasionally paused to explain his process to those around him. "This valve here," he said one day, pointing to a small component, "is designed to regulate pressure. If it gets clogged, the entire system overheats." His explanations were simple yet precise, making even the most complex mechanisms sound easy to understand. The engineers listened intently, jotting down every word. Some even began referring to Joe as the professor behind his back, though none dared say it to his face. Despite his growing reputation, Joe remained humble. When praised for his knowledge, he simply shrugged. "It's just how things work," he would say. "Nothing special about it." But to those watching, it was clear that there was something extraordinary about him. How could a janitor possess such expertise? The question lingered in everyone's minds, fueling endless speculation. One afternoon, Sarah, the young engineer who had approached Joe earlier, decided to confront him directly. She waited until the crowd around the engine thinned out before stepping forward. "Joe," she began hesitantly, "I have to ask, where did you learn all this? I mean, you're not just fixing the engine, you're teaching us stuff we didn't even know." Joe stopped what he was doing and looked at her. For a moment, his expression softened, as if he were considering how much to reveal. Then, with a faint smile, he said, "Let's just say I've seen my share of machines." Sarah frowned, unsatisfied with the vague answer. "But you talk like someone who's been designing engines for years. Are you hiding something?" Joe chuckled softly. "Not hiding, exactly," he replied. "Just keeping some things to myself. Everyone has their reasons, don't they?" His cryptic response only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Sarah walked away feeling both frustrated and intrigued. She wasn't the only one. Richard, too, found himself increasingly obsessed with uncovering Joe's past. The CEO couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encountered someone like Joe before, someone whose brilliance with machines had left a lasting impression. But try as he might, Richard couldn't place the connection. Meanwhile, Joe's progress on the engine continued to astound everyone. Piece by piece, he identified and resolved issues that had baffled the engineering team for weeks. Faulty wiring was replaced, misaligned gears were adjusted, and worn-out components were swapped out. With precision, with each repair, the engine roared to life a little stronger, its vibrations echoing through the factory floor. By the end of the week, it was almost unrecognizable from the malfunctioning hulk it had been days earlier. Yet, despite the visible improvements, Joe refused to declare victory prematurely. "There's still one last thing," he told Sarah when she asked if he was done. "The core issue isn't fixed yet. Until then, we won't know if it'll hold." His caution earned him even more admiration from the engineers, who appreciated his meticulous approach. It also sparked curiosity among the workers, many of whom gathered after hours to discuss Joe's mysterious background. Rumors circulated wildly. Some claimed he was a retired NASA engineer, while others whispered that he might be a former competitor turned recluse. No one knew for sure, but the stories only added to the intrigue. Amidst the whirlwind of activity, Joe remained grounded. He ate lunch alone in a corner of the cafeteria, sipping tea and reading old technical manuals he kept tucked inside his toolbox. Occasionally, someone would join him, hoping to pry more information out of him. But Joe deflected their questions, with polite smiles and vague answers, never revealing too much. Richard, determined to unravel the truth, decided to take matters into his own hands. One evening, after most of the workers had gone home, he approached Joe while the janitor tinkered with the engine. "Mind if I join you?" Richard asked, pulling up a stool. Joe glanced up briefly before returning to his work. "Suit yourself," he said. For a while they sat in silence, the rhythmic clinking of tools filling the air. Finally, Richard broke the quiet. "You're incredible at this, Joe. Honestly, I've never seen anyone tackle a project like this so effortlessly. Where did you learn these skills?" Joe paused, his wrench hovering mid-air. After a long moment, he sighed and set the tool down. "All right, Mr. Grayson," he said quietly. "Since you're so curious, I'll tell you. But promise me one thing. You won't make a big deal out of it." Richard nodded eagerly. "You have my word." Joe leaned back against the workbench, staring at the engine as if lost in thought. "Years ago," he began, "I wasn't always a janitor. Back then, I worked as an engineer, designer actually. I helped create some of the first-generation engines your company uses today. My name was well known in the industry, or so I thought." Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait, Are you saying you're Joseph Carter? Joe winced slightly at the mention of his full name. That was me, yes. But that life ended a long time ago. Things got complicated. Personal issues, professional rivalries, mistakes I made. Eventually, I decided to step away. I wanted peace, anonymity. So I came here, took a job as a janitor, and stayed out of the spotlight. The revelation hit Richard like a freight train. Joseph Carter was a legend in the engineering world, a pioneer whose designs had revolutionized the industry. His disappearance decades ago had been shrouded in mystery, sparking debates and conspiracy theories. And now, here he was, standing right in front of Richard, working as a janitor in his factory. But why keep it a secret? Richard asked, still struggling to process what he'd heard. Why not come back to the field? You could have done amazing things. Joe shook his head. Because I learned the hard way that fame isn't worth it. People expect perfection, and when you slip up, they tear you apart. I didn't want any part of that anymore. This life suits me fine. His words carried a weight that silenced Richard. For the first time, the CEO saw Joe not just as a janitor or a skilled mechanic, but as a man burdened by his own past. It was a humbling realization, one that forced Richard to reconsider everything he thought he knew about success and identity. As the night wore on, Richard left Joe to finish his work, his mind racing with possibilities. Little did either of them know, this discovery would soon ripple through the company, changing lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The engine was almost fixed, but the real transformation was only beginning. The revelation of Joe's true identity spread like wildfire through Grayson Industries. It started innocently enough. A whispered conversation between two engineers during lunch, a comment overheard by a curious intern, and soon the entire factory was buzzing with the news. Joseph Carter is here, people murmured in awe. The Joseph Carter. To many it felt surreal, like meeting a character from history books or hearing that a retired superhero had been living quietly among them. Richard Grayson found himself at the center of the storm. As the CEO who had unwittingly uncovered Joe's secret, he became both the storyteller and the guardian of this incredible truth. At first, Richard struggled with how to handle the situation. Should he announce it publicly, giving Joe the recognition he deserved? Or should he respect the janitor's wishes and keep the information private? After much deliberation, Richard decided on a compromise. He would reveal Joe's past, but only after consulting with the man himself. When Richard approached Joe the next morning, he found him working as usual, seemingly unfazed by the whispers swirling around him. Joe, Richard began cautiously, people are starting to talk. They know who you are, or at least they suspect. Joe paused, his wrench hovering midair. For a moment he looked older, wearier. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. I figured as much, he said quietly. It was bound to happen eventually. Do you want me to address it? Richard asked. We can make an official announcement if you'd prefer. Joe shook his head firmly. No announcements, he replied. If people ask, I'll tell them the truth. But I don't need fanfare or attention. That's not why I'm here. His response left Richard torn. On one hand, he respected Joe's desire for privacy. On the other, he couldn't ignore the impact this revelation could have, not just on Joe, but on the company. The legend of Joseph Carter wasn't just a story. It was a piece of engineering history. By keeping it hidden, Richard felt like he was denying the world something valuable. Still, he honored Joe's wishes. For now. Instead of making a formal announcement, Richard called a meeting with the senior management team. He explained the situation carefully, emphasizing Joe's contributions to the company and his role in fixing the malfunctioning engine. This isn't just about solving a technical problem, Richard told them. It's about recognizing talent no matter where it comes from. The executives listened in stunned silence. Some were skeptical, others impressed, but all agreed that Joe's involvement needed acknowledgement. One executive suggested offering him a promotion, perhaps even reinstating him as a lead engineer. Another proposed creating a mentorship program, led by Joe to pass on his knowledge to younger employees. Richard liked these ideas but knew they wouldn't work unless Joe agreed. That evening, Richard sat down with Joe again, this time in his office. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Joe," he began, "we'd like to offer you a position on our senior advisory board. Your experience and expertise are invaluable, and we think you could do great things for the company." Joe raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You're serious?" "Completely," Richard replied. "Think about it. You've already proven yourself with the engine. Imagine what else you could accomplish if you stayed involved." For a long moment, Joe didn't respond. He stared out the window, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Grayson. Really, I do. But I left that life behind for a reason. I don't know if I'm ready to step back into it." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of Joe's decision. "Take your time," he said gently. "But remember, the door is always open." Over the next few days, Joe wrestled with the idea. Part of him wanted to decline outright, to return to the simplicity of sweeping floors and avoiding the spotlight. But another part of him stirred with nostalgia. Memories of his younger days flooded back. Late nights spent sketching designs. The thrill of seeing his creations come to life. The sense of purpose that came with solving impossible problems. Those memories reminded him of who he used to be, and who he still could be. One afternoon, as Joe worked on final adjustments to the engine, Sarah approached him. She had become one of his closest allies during the repair process, often staying late to assist him. "Joe," she said hesitantly, "can I ask you something personal?" Joe smiled faintly. "Go ahead." "Why did you leave engineering?" she asked. "You're so good at it, why walk away?" Her question caught him off guard. For a moment, he considered brushing it off with his usual vague response. But then, looking into her earnest eyes, he decided to be honest. "Because I got burned out," he admitted. "Back then, I thought success meant constantly pushing harder, doing more, being better. I lost sight of why I loved it in the first place. And when things went wrong, when I made mistakes, I couldn't handle the pressure, so I walked away." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," Joe admitted. "But I also love the freedom I have now. No expectations, no deadlines, no judgment." "That's fair," Sarah said. "But don't you think coming back, even just a little, could remind you of what you loved about it? You've already inspired so many of us. Just imagine what else you could do." Her words lingered in Joe's mind long after she left. That night, as he lay awake in bed, he realized she was right. Walking away had given him peace, but it had also kept him from sharing his passion with others. Maybe it was time to find a balance, a way to contribute without losing himself in the process. The following week, Joe accepted Richard's offer. He agreed to join the advisory board, not as Joseph Carter the legend, but as Joe the mentor. His role would focus on guiding young engineers, teaching them the skills and mindset that had once defined his career. In return, the company promised to keep his past low-key, respecting his preference for anonymity. When the news broke, the reaction was overwhelming. Employees cheered, executives praised the decision, and even local media picked up the story. For the first time in decades, Joseph Carter's name resurfaced in headlines. But this time, it wasn't about his achievements. It was about his humility, his wisdom, and his willingness to help others succeed. As Joe settled into his new role, he discovered a renewed sense of purpose. Teaching came naturally to him, and his students quickly learned to value his insights. Under his guidance, the engineering team grew stronger, more innovative, and more confident. Meanwhile, Richard watched proudly, knowing he had played a small part in bringing Joe back to the field he loved. But the journey wasn't over yet. With Joe's return came questions about his past, the controversies, the rivalries, the mistakes he had mentioned in passing. As curiosity mounted, Richard knew it was only a matter of time before the full story came to light. And when it did, it would change everything, for Joe, for the company, and for everyone who had ever doubted the power of second chances. Joe's transition from janitor to mentor marked a turning point not just for him, but for the entire culture of Grayson Industries. At first, some employees were skeptical. Could the man who had spent years sweeping floors really teach them anything new? But Joe quickly proved his doubters wrong. His lessons weren't just about fixing machines, they were about problem-solving, creativity, and perseverance. He shared stories from his past, how he had once worked on engines so advanced that even NASA considered using them, how he had faced failure after failure before finally succeeding, and how those failures had taught him more than any success ever could. One day, during a training session with a group of young engineers, Joe held up a small, seemingly insignificant gear. "This," he said, holding it aloft, "is what makes the whole machine work. Without it, everything falls apart. Never underestimate the little things. They matter more than you think." The room fell silent as the engineers absorbed his words. For many of them, it was a lesson that went beyond engineering. It was a reminder to value every detail, every person, and every contribution, no matter how small it seemed. As Joe's influence grew, so did the respect people had for him. Workers who had once dismissed him as just the janitor now greeted him warmly, seeking his advice not only on technical matters but also on personal challenges. Joe listened patiently, offering wisdom gained from decades of experience. He became a confidant, a guide, and most importantly, a friend to many. Richard Grayson, too, underwent a transformation. Before meeting Joe, Richard had been a CEO defined by ambition and results. Success in his eyes was measured by numbers, profit margins, production rates, and market shares. But watching Joe interact with the staff, teaching and inspiring without expecting anything in return, made Richard reconsider his approach to leadership. He began spending more time on the factory floor, talking to employees, listening to their concerns, and learning from their experiences. Slowly but surely, the rigid hierarchy that had once defined Grayson Industries began to soften, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. Still, Joe's past remained a topic of fascination. While he willingly shared tidbits of his story during training sessions, there were gaps, moments he skipped over or avoided entirely. These omissions fueled curiosity, especially among the older employees who remembered Joseph Carter's name from industry journals and trade magazines. One afternoon, an elderly technician named Walter pulled Richard aside. "You don't know the full story, do you?" he asked cryptically. "What do you mean?" Richard replied, intrigued. Walter hesitated before speaking. Back when Joseph Carter disappeared, it wasn't just because of burnout. There were complications. Rumors of stolen designs, lawsuits, accusations. Some say he walked away to protect himself, or maybe to protect someone else. The revelation startled Richard. Until now, he had assumed Joe's departure was purely personal, a decision driven by exhaustion and disillusionment. But if Walter's information was true, then Joe's story was far more complex than anyone realized. Determined to uncover the truth, Richard decided to dig deeper. That evening, he invited Joe to dinner at his home, an informal gathering meant to express gratitude for everything Joe had done for the company. Over steaks and wine, the conversation turned reflective. Richard waited until dessert before broaching the subject. "Joe," he began carefully, "there's something I need to ask. When you left the industry all those years ago, was it really just because of burnout?" Joe froze, his fork hovering above his plate. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, with a heavy sigh, Joe set his utensils down. "No," he admitted quietly. "It wasn't just burnout." Richard leaned forward, sensing the weight of the moment. "What happened?" Joe took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "It started with a project. A revolutionary engine design I had been working on for years. It was my masterpiece, something I truly believed would change the world. But when it came time to patent it, things got messy. My business partner claimed half the credit, saying he had contributed ideas I never gave him. A lawsuit followed, dragging my name through the mud. Reporters wrote articles questioning my integrity, accusing me of plagiarism and fraud. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I fought back, of course. I had evidence proving I was the sole creator. But the legal battle drained me, not just financially, but emotionally. By the time it ended, my reputation was tarnished. People stopped trusting me. Contracts dried up. Friends turned their backs. I couldn't take it anymore, so I walked away. I needed a fresh start. Richard listened intently, his heart aching for the man sitting across from him. And your partner? What happened to him? He thrived, Joe replied bitterly. With my design under his belt, he launched a successful company, made millions. Meanwhile, I faded into obscurity. The injustice of it all hit Richard hard. How could someone so talented, so brilliant, be reduced to living in the shadows while others profited from his work? Determined to make amends, Richard vowed to help Joe reclaim his legacy, but not in the way one might expect. Instead of confronting Joe's former partner or seeking revenge, Richard focused on celebrating Joe's contributions within Grayson Industries. Under his direction, the company began incorporating elements of Joe's original designs into their latest projects. They credited him openly, ensuring his name appeared in patents, press releases, and advertisements. Slowly but surely, Joseph Carter's reputation was restored, not as a victim but as a visionary whose brilliance continued to shape the future. For Joe, this resurgence brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt vindicated, proud that his work was finally being recognized. On the other, he struggled with the attention, worried that revisiting his past might reopen old wounds. But with Richard's support and the unwavering loyalty of his colleagues, he found strength in facing his fears. By the end of the year, Grayson Industries unveiled a new line of engines inspired by Joe's innovations. These machines were faster, stronger, and more efficient than anything the company had produced before. At the launch event, Richard stood beside Joe, addressing a crowd of reporters and industry leaders. Today, he declared, we honor a man whose genius has changed our world. Joseph Carter isn't just a mentor or an advisor, he's a legend, and we are privileged to have him with us. As applause filled the room, Joe stepped forward, visibly moved. Thank you, he said simply, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. But remember this, greatness isn't about titles or accolades. It's about making a difference in your work, in your relationships, and in the lives of others. That's what truly matters. His words resonated deeply, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. For Richard, it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career. For Joe, it was a reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding meaning in the present and hope for the future. As the night drew to a close, Joe slipped away quietly, content to let the spotlight fade. Yet even in the background, his presence loomed large, a testament to the power of resilience, humility, and second chances. And though his journey was far from over, one thing was certain. Joseph Carter's legacy would endure, not as a tale of triumph or tragedy, but as a story of humanity. Months passed, and the impact of Joe's return to engineering rippled far beyond Grayson Industries. The new line of engines inspired by his designs became a sensation, earning accolades from industry experts and customers alike. They were faster, more efficient, and environmentally friendly, a perfect blend of innovation and practicality. Orders poured in from companies around the world, catapulting Grayson Industries to the forefront of technological advancement. But for Joe, the real reward wasn't fame or fortune. It was seeing his ideas come to life again, knowing that his work would continue to make a difference long after he was gone. Despite his growing recognition, Joe remained grounded. He still wore his old coveralls, still carried his trusty toolbox, and still preferred working quietly in the background rather than basking in the spotlight. Yet there was a subtle change in him, a renewed sense of purpose. Teaching had awakened something within Joe, reminding him why he had fallen in love with engineering in the first place. It wasn't about titles or patents. It was about solving problems, creating solutions, and inspiring others to do the same. As word of Joe's contributions spread, invitations began arriving, from universities wanting him to give lectures, from organizations hoping to honor him with awards, and even from former rivals seeking reconciliation. At first, Joe declined most of these offers, preferring to stay focused on his role at Grayson Industries. But Richard encouraged him to step out occasionally, arguing that sharing his story could inspire countless others. "You've earned this, Joe," Richard said one day. "Don't let fear hold you back." Reluctantly, Joe agreed. His first public appearance was at a prestigious engineering conference where he delivered a keynote speech titled, "The Power of Humility." Standing on stage before hundreds of eager faces, Joe spoke candidly about his journey, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. He talked about the importance of perseverance, the value of learning from failure, and the courage it takes to start over. By the time he finished, the audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in admiration. Afterward, dozens of attendees lined up to meet him, shaking his hand and thanking him for his words. Among them was a young woman named Emily, a graduate student struggling to find her place in the male-dominated field of engineering. She approached Joe nervously, clutching a notebook filled with sketches and equations. "Mr. Carter," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, your story gives me hope. I've been told I'm not good enough, that I don't belong here. But hearing you talk makes me believe I can keep going." Joe smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily," he said gently, "don't listen to those voices. You belong wherever your passion takes you. And remember, success isn't about proving yourself to others. It's about staying true to who you are." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she nodded. That moment stayed with Joe long after the conference ended. It reminded him that his legacy wasn't just about machines or blueprints. It was about people, the lives he touched, the dreams he reignited, and the paths he helped pave for future generations. Back at Grayson Industries, the culture continued to evolve under Joe's influence. Employees no longer saw themselves as mere cogs in a machine. They viewed themselves as contributors to something greater. Collaboration replaced competition, creativity flourished, and innovation became second nature. Even Richard noticed a shift in how decisions were made. Instead of relying solely on data and projections, he began prioritizing human connections, listening to feedback, and empowering his team to take risks. In doing so, he transformed not only the company, but also himself. One afternoon, as Richard walked through the factory floor, he stopped beside Joe, who was helping a group of interns troubleshoot a prototype engine. Watching Joe explain concepts with patience and clarity, Richard felt a surge of gratitude. "You've changed us, Joe," he said when the interns moved away. "Not just the company, but all of us individually." Joe chuckled softly. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Grayson. People have always had potential, it just needed a little encouragement." Richard shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You've reminded us what it means to lead with heart. That's something I'll never forget." Their bond had grown stronger over the months, evolving from professional respect to genuine friendship. Richard often sought Joe's advice, valuing his perspective on both business and life. For Joe, having someone like Richard, a man once defined by ambition, embrace humility and empathy was proof that change was possible, no matter how entrenched one's habits might be. Years later, when Joe finally decided to retire, the entire company came together to celebrate his achievements. The farewell party was held in the factory, where banners adorned the walls and tables overflowed with food. Employees from every department attended, eager to express their gratitude. Some shared stories of how Joe had helped them overcome challenges. Others presented gifts and tokens of appreciation. Through it all, Joe remained humble, deflecting praise onto those around him. In his farewell speech, Joe reflected on his journey, from his days as a celebrated engineer to his years as a janitor, and finally to his role as a mentor and advisor. "Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons," he said. his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. It taught me that success isn't measured by titles or trophies. It's measured by the impact we have on others. If I've managed to leave even a small mark on your lives, then I consider my time here well spent. The room erupted into applause, tears streaming down many faces. As Joe stepped down from the podium, Richard approached him, holding out a framed photograph. It showed Joe surrounded by the latest batch of interns, their faces glowing with excitement and pride. "This is your legacy, Joe," Richard said. "Not the engines, not the patents, but the people you've inspired." Joe accepted the gift with a nod, his expression softening. "Thank you, Richard, for everything." After retiring, Joe moved to a quiet coastal town, where he spent his days fishing, reading, and tinkering with old machines in his garage. Occasionally, he received letters from former colleagues and students, updating him on their progress and expressing their gratitude. Each note brought a smile to his face, reaffirming that his work had truly mattered. Meanwhile, Grayson Industries thrived. Under the principles Joe had instilled, the company became known not just for its cutting-edge technology, but also for its commitment to fostering talent and promoting inclusivity. Engineers trained by Joe went on to lead groundbreaking projects, carrying forward his legacy of innovation and kindness. And though Joseph Carter eventually faded from public memory, his story lived on, in the engines that powered industries, in the hearts of those he had mentored, and in the lessons he had taught about resilience, humility, and the enduring power of second chances. For Richard, Joe's journey served as a constant reminder of what true leadership looked like. It wasn't about authority or control. It was about lifting others up, recognizing their potential, and creating opportunities for them to shine. As he stood on the factory floor years later, watching a new generation of engineers work together seamlessly, Richard couldn't help but smile. Joe may have left, but his spirit remained, an invisible force guiding Grayson Industries toward a brighter, more compassionate future. And in that legacy, everyone found a piece of themselves.